The morning mist hung low over London as thousands gathered outside Westminster Abbey. Nobody quite knew what to expect from this day, but everyone sensed something profound was about to unfold. Among the crowd stood Margaret Thompson, a 70-year-old grandmother who had traveled from Scotland just to be there. She clutched a faded photograph of her late husband, a veteran who had served the crown for 30 years. Prince William and Princess Kate had announced they would be making an appearance, but the purpose remained mysteriously unspecified. The royal couple had been increasingly visible in recent months, attending various charity events and community gatherings, but something about today felt different. The usually chatty British press had been unusually quiet, with only cryptic hints about a moment of national significance. Inside Kensington Palace earlier that morning, William stood before a mirror, adjusting his tie with hands that trembled slightly. Kate entered the room, her presence immediately calming. She wore a simple black dress, elegant yet understated, adorned only with a small poppy pin. Their eyes met in the mirror, and without words, they understood the weight of what they were about to do. The decision had not come easily. For weeks, William had struggled with the protocol, the tradition, the expectations that came with his position. But recent events had shaken him to his core. The country was divided, struggling with economic hardship, social unrest, and a growing sense of disconnection from its institutions. The monarchy, that ancient symbol of continuity and stability, seemed increasingly distant from the people it served. It had been Kate who first suggested the gesture. During a late-night conversation in their private quarters, she had spoken softly but firmly about the need for genuine connection, for breaking down the barriers that history had erected between the crown and the people. William had listened, his initial resistance gradually melting away as he recognized the truth in her words. The convoy of black cars moved silently through the London streets. Inside the lead vehicle, William held Kate's hand, their fingers intertwined in mutual support. Neither spoke, but both understood the magnitude of what they were about to do. This was not just another royal engagement. This was a moment that would redefine their roles and potentially reshape the monarchy itself. As they arrived at Westminster Abbey, the crowd pressed forward, phones raised, voices calling out. But something in the couple's demeanor caused a gradual hush to fall over the assembled masses. William and Kate walked slowly, deliberately, their faces serious but not stern. They stopped at the Abbey steps, and for a long moment, simply stood there, looking out at the sea of faces before them. Then, in a movement so unexpected that gasps rippled through the crowd, William and Kate began to descend the steps. But instead of the usual royal wave and swift entrance into the building, they continued walking, moving directly toward the barriers that separated them from the public. Security officers tensed, clearly unprepared for this deviation from protocol. Kate was the first to reach out. She extended her hand to an elderly woman in the front row, not for a brief handshake, but clasping both hands around the woman's weathered fingers. The woman's eyes filled with tears as Kate leaned in, listening intently to words spoken in a trembling voice. William followed suit, moving along the barrier, making eye contact, touching shoulders, accepting the flowers, letters, and photographs thrust toward him. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most extraordinary moments in modern royal history. A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, suddenly broke free from his mother's grasp and ducked under the barrier. Security moved to intercept him, but William raised his hand, stopping them. The boy ran straight to the prince, throwing his arms around William's legs. Instead of the expected awkward moment and swift removal, William knelt down, bringing himself to the child's eye level. The conversation between the prince and the boy was inaudible to the crowd, but the image, the future king of England on his knees, speaking earnestly with a common child, burned itself into the national consciousness. Kate joined them, and for several minutes, the three formed a small, intimate circle in the midst of thousands. When William finally stood, he did something unprecedented. He lifted the barrier, not just for the boy to return to his mother, but lifting it entirely, setting it aside. The symbolic gesture was unmistakable. Kate moved to another section and did the same. One by one, the barriers came down, and the crowd, initially hesitant, began to move forward. What followed was not chaos, but rather a remarkable display of British restraint mixed with deep emotion. People approached slowly, respectfully, many with tears streaming down their faces. William and Kate moved among them, not as royals granting an audience, but as fellow human beings sharing a moment of profound connection. An elderly veteran approached William, his medals glinting in the morning sun. Without prompting, he began to tell his story of service, of sacrifice, of a son lost in Afghanistan. William listened, his own eyes glistening, and when the man finished, the prince embraced him. Not a formal, brief royal contact, but a genuine, prolonged embrace that spoke of shared grief and understanding. Kate found herself surrounded by mothers, many holding young children. One woman pressed a crumpled envelope into her hands, explaining through tears that it contained a letter her daughter had written to the princess, but never had the courage to send. Kate opened it there, and then, reading the childish scrawl that spoke of dreams and hopes and the desire to be brave like Princess Kate, the scheduled event at Westminster Abbey was forgotten. What was meant to be a 30-minute appearance stretched to over 3 hours. William and Kate moved through the crowd, sometimes together, sometimes apart, but always with the same genuine engagement. They sat on the cold stone steps with teenagers, discussing their fears about the future. They knelt with children, admiring drawings and listening to stories about school and friends and pets. A group of nurses, still in their uniforms after a night shift, approached Kate. They spoke of the strain on the healthcare system, of their exhaustion, of their fear that their service was going unrecognized. Kate not only listened but asked detailed questions, showing a knowledge of their struggles that surprised them. When one nurse broke down, overwhelmed by the acknowledgement, Kate held her, stroking her back like a sister would. Meanwhile, William found himself in deep conversation with a group of unemployed factory workers. They spoke of dignity, of the desire to work, of feeling forgotten by a system that seemed to value profits over people. The prince's responses showed not just sympathy, but understanding, and when he spoke of the need for change, for a society that valued every contribution, his words carried the weight of sincere conviction. As the morning wore on, word spread through social media and news outlets. The images were extraordinary, the future king and queen not performing charity, but practicing humanity. The carefully constructed walls of protocol and tradition had crumbled, replaced by something far more powerful, genuine human connection. A young mother approached Kate with a baby in her arms. She explained that she had named her daughter Catherine, after the princess, hoping she would grow up to be strong and compassionate. Kate asked to hold the baby, and as she cradled the infant, she spoke softly to the mother about the challenges and joys of parenthood, sharing her own experiences with a frankness that was unprecedented for a royal in public. The crowd had grown exponentially as news spread. People abandoned their work, their shopping, their daily routines to witness this extraordinary event. But, remarkably, despite the absence of barriers and formal crowd control, order maintained itself. It was as if the very act of trust demonstrated by William and Kate had called forth the best in everyone present. A group of immigrants, hesitant and standing at the edge of the crowd, caught William's eye. He walked directly to them, extending his hand in greeting. Through a translator, they expressed their gratitude for being welcomed in Britain, but also their struggles with integration and acceptance. William listened intently, and when he spoke of Britain's strength lying in its diversity, of every person's contribution being valued, several in the group wept openly. Kate, meanwhile, had been approached by a young woman in a wheelchair. The woman spoke of feeling invisible, of a society that seemed designed to exclude her. Kate sat on the ground beside the wheelchair, bringing herself to the same level, and for 20 minutes they talked. Not about disability, but about dreams, ambitions, and the barriers that society erected unnecessarily. When they parted, the young woman was smiling through her tears, clutching a promise from Kate to visit her advocacy group. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and still William and Kate showed no signs of concluding their impromptu gathering. They had removed their coats despite the chill, rolled up sleeves, and continued moving through the ever-growing crowd. Each interaction seemed to energize rather than exhaust them, as if they were drawing strength from the connections being forged. A teacher brought forward a group of school children who had been on a field trip to see the Abbey. The children, initially shy, soon opened up under Kate's gentle questioning. They spoke of their dreams to be doctors, artists, footballers, scientists. William joined the group, and together the royal couple spent time with each child, asking about their studies, their hopes, their fears. When one little girl admitted she was scared of failing, Kate knelt beside her, speaking words of encouragement that the child would remember for the rest of her life. The media, initially caught off guard, had arrived in force. But instead of the usual orchestrated photo opportunities, they found themselves documenting something raw and unprecedented. The images captured were not of royal perfection, but of human connection. William with dirt on his knees from kneeling on the ground, Kate with tears on her cheeks as she comforted a grieving widow, both of them fully present in each moment, each interaction. As noon approached, the crowd had swelled to fill the entire area around Westminster Abbey. Police estimates later suggested over 50,000 people had gathered, but the atmosphere remained peaceful, almost reverent. People waited patiently for their moment, understanding that what they were witnessing was not just a royal appearance, but a transformation of what monarchy could mean in the modern world. An elderly man approached William with a petition. He explained that his community had been fighting to save a local hospital from closure, gathering thousands of signatures that had been ignored by authorities. William took the petition, reading through it carefully, asking questions about the community's needs. When he promised that their voices would be heard, that he would personally ensure the petition reached the right people, the man broke down, overwhelmed that someone in power had finally listened. Kate found herself with a group of young mothers, many struggling with isolation and depression. They spoke of feeling judged, of the pressure to be perfect, of the loneliness that could accompany early motherhood. Kate shared her own struggles, speaking with a candor that would have been unthinkable in previous generations of royals. She talked about sleepless nights, about doubts, about the challenge of balancing public duty with private life. Her honesty created an immediate bond, and soon the group was laughing and crying together like old friends. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the square, but neither William nor Kate showed any inclination to leave. They had been on their feet for hours, had spoken with hundreds of people, had shared in countless stories of joy and sorrow, hope and fear. Their faces showed exhaustion, but their eyes remained bright with purpose. A group of artists and musicians had gathered, and spontaneous performances began throughout the crowd. William and Kate moved between these impromptu shows, listening to songs written about struggle and hope, viewing paintings that captured the complexity of modern British life. They engaged with the artists not as patrons bestowing approval, but as fellow citizens appreciating the power of creative expression to unite and heal. As the day wore on, something remarkable happened. The crowd began to self-organize, creating pathways for William and Kate to move through, ensuring everyone had a chance for interaction. People who had already spent time with the royal couple began assisting others, translating for those who didn't speak English, helping elderly or disabled individuals navigate the crowd. The hierarchical structure of a royal event had been replaced by a community coming together in mutual support. A young man approached William with visible nervousness. He explained that he had recently left prison and was struggling to reintegrate into society. The stigma followed him everywhere, making it impossible to find work or acceptance. William listened without judgment, and when he placed his hand on the young man's shoulder, speaking words of encouragement and second chances, the symbolic power of the moment was lost on no one. The future king was publicly embracing someone society had rejected. Kate, surrounded by a group of teenagers, was discussing mental health. The young people spoke with remarkable openness about their struggles with anxiety, depression, and the pressure of social media. Kate's responses showed not just sympathy, but deep understanding, and when she shared some of her own coping strategies, the teenagers listened with rapt attention. One girl, who had been silent throughout, suddenly spoke up about her suicide attempt. Kate immediately moved to her, holding her hands, speaking words of affirmation and hope that would later be credited with saving the girl's life. The sun began to set, painting the London sky in brilliant oranges and purples. William and Kate had been among the people for over 8 hours, far exceeding any previous royal engagement. Their staff, initially frantic about schedule and protocol, had long since given up trying to manage the situation. This was no longer an event that could be controlled or concluded according to plan. A final group approached as darkness began to fall. They were homeless individuals who had been watching from the periphery all day, too uncertain of their welcome to come forward earlier. But William noticed them and walked over, Kate close behind. There was no hesitation, no pulling back from their unwashed clothes or weathered faces. The royal couple sat with them on the cold ground, listening to stories of how they had fallen through society's cracks. One man, his voice rough from years on the streets, spoke of having once been a soldier, proud to serve his country, only to find himself abandoned when mental health issues made it impossible to maintain a normal life. William's response was immediate and visceral. He spoke of the nation's duty to those who had served, of the shame of allowing veterans to suffer in silence and neglect. His words carried the weight of future action, not just present sympathy. As full darkness fell, the crowd began to spontaneously light candles and phone torches. The sea of small lights created an ethereal atmosphere, transforming the square into something almost sacred. William and Kate, standing together now, looked out at the thousands who had gathered, and the emotion on their faces was unmistakable. William stepped forward, his voice carrying in the quiet evening air. He spoke without notes, without preparation, straight from the heart. He talked about the privilege of spending this day with the people, of hearing their stories, their hopes, their fears. He spoke of a monarchy that existed not above the people, but among them, not to rule, but to serve, not to judge, but to unite. Kate joined him, her voice strong despite the emotion. She spoke of the strength she had witnessed, the resilience, the compassion that people showed for one another despite their own struggles. She promised that this day was not an ending, but a beginning, that the barriers that had come down would not be rebuilt, that the distance between palace and people would continue to shrink. The crowd's response was extraordinary. Instead of cheers or applause, a silence fell, profound and moving. Then, somewhere in the darkness, a single voice began to sing. It was an old hymn, one that spoke of hope and unity. Other voices joined, and soon thousands were singing together, their voices rising into the night sky. William and Kate stood hand in hand, tears flowing freely down their faces as they listened to their people sing. This was not the national anthem, not a song of monarchy or empire, but something deeper, a hymn of humanity, of shared experience, of hope for a better tomorrow. As the song ended, William and Kate began to move through the crowd one final time. But now they were not the only ones offering comfort and connection. Throughout the square, people were embracing, sharing contact information, making plans to continue the conversations that had begun. The community that had formed throughout this extraordinary day was already planning its continuation. The royal couple's departure was as unconventional as their arrival. There was no formal conclusion, no orchestrated exit. They simply continued moving through the crowd until they reached their car, pausing countless times for final words, final embraces. Even as they entered the vehicle, windows were lowered, hands extended for final touches. As the car slowly pulled away, the crowd did not disperse. People remained, talking, sharing, processing what they had experienced. Many would later describe it as a turning point, not just for the monarchy, but for the nation itself. The barriers that had been removed were not just physical, but psychological, emotional, spiritual. In the following days, the impact of what became known as the day the barriers came down rippled throughout British society. The images and stories dominated not just national, but international media. But more importantly, the connections made that day continued to grow. Support groups formed among those who had met. The young woman in the wheelchair found her advocacy group flooded with new supporters, including a surprising patron in the Princess of Wales. The homeless veterans William had sat with found themselves at the center of a new initiative, personally championed by the prince, to ensure no one who had served their country would sleep on the streets. The immigrants who had spoken of feeling unwelcome discovered a network of support, with William publicly and repeatedly affirming their place in British society. The young ex-prisoner who had feared rejection found employment through a program that Kate had quietly initiated, working with businesses to provide second chances. The mothers who had spoken of isolation formed playgroups and support networks, with Kate occasionally appearing unannounced to join their gatherings. The petition to save the local hospital not only reached the right authorities, but became a catalyst for a broader examination of community healthcare needs. William's personal intervention ensured that voices that had been ignored were finally heard, and the hospital was not only saved but expanded. But perhaps the most profound change was less tangible but more pervasive. The relationship between the monarchy and the people had been fundamentally altered. The ancient institution had shown it could evolve, could meet the needs of a modern nation not through pageantry and distance, but through genuine human connection. William and Kate's approach to their duties transformed. Regular barrier-free events became a cornerstone of their public engagement. They showed up in communities without fanfare, sat in living rooms and community centers, listened more than they spoke. The formal protocols that had defined royal interactions for centuries were quietly set aside in favor of authentic engagement. Other members of the royal family, initially skeptical, began to follow suit. The ripple effect spread throughout the institution, breathing new life into an ancient system that had risked becoming irrelevant. The monarchy found renewed purpose not in its history or its ceremonies, but in its ability to unite, to listen, to serve. The young girl who had admitted her fear of failure to Kate that day grew up to become a teacher herself, carrying with her the words of encouragement she had received. She would tell her students about the day a princess sat on the ground with her and told her that failure was not something to fear, but something to learn from. Many of those students would go on to achieve things they might never have attempted without that story of royal encouragement. The mother who had pressed the crumpled letter into Kate's hands received a response. Not a formal royal correspondence, but a handwritten note that her daughter treasured for the rest of her life. It spoke of dreams and courage and the importance of every voice, no matter how small. That daughter would grow up to become an advocate for children's rights. Inspired by the day a princess took the time to read her childhood thoughts. The nurses who had spoken of their exhaustion found their concerns elevated to national attention. William and Kate didn't just listen that day. They acted. Healthcare worker support became a primary focus of their charitable efforts, and real changes in working conditions followed. Many of those nurses would later credit that morning's conversation with saving their careers, giving them the strength to continue when they had been ready to quit. The unemployed factory workers discovered that their words had not fallen on deaf ears. William's subsequent speeches and interventions focused increasingly on the dignity of work, on economic systems that valued people over profits. While change was slow, it was real, and many found new opportunities through programs the prince personally championed. Years later, historians would mark that day at Westminster Abbey as a turning point in British history. Not because of any grand declaration or political change, but because it was the day the barriers came down, not just the physical ones, but the invisible walls that had separated crown from country, privilege from people, those who governed from those who were governed. The image that endured in the national memory was not one of royal grandeur, but of simple humanity. William on his knees, speaking to a child. Kate sitting on cold stone, comforting a stranger. Both of them dusty and tear-stained and utterly present. It was the day the nation discovered that their future king and queen were not distant figures, but fellow travelers on the difficult journey of being human. The silent gesture of removing those barriers had spoken louder than any proclamation. It said that in this new era, there would be no separation between those who served and those who were served. It promised a monarchy that would stand with the people, not above them, that would share in their joys and sorrows not as observers, but as participants. As the years passed, that day's legacy lived on in countless ways. Children who had been lifted over barriers grew up believing that any barrier could be overcome. Adults who had been heard when they expected to be ignored found their voices and used them. A nation that had been fracturing found a moment of unity that reminded them of what they shared rather than what divided them. William and Kate aged as all people do, but the connection forged that day never weakened. They became not just sovereigns, but symbols of what leadership could be when it was rooted in genuine care for others. Their reign, when it came, was marked not by distance and ceremony, but by proximity and authenticity. The Abbey steps where it all began became a place of pilgrimage of sorts. Not religious pilgrimage, but human pilgrimage. People would come and sit where William had knelt, stand where Kate had embraced strangers, remember the day when the most powerful chose to become vulnerable, when those who could have remained distant chose instead to draw near. On each anniversary of that day, no formal celebration was held. Instead, William and Kate would simply appear somewhere in the kingdom, barriers down, hearts open, ready to listen and to serve. And each year, wherever they appeared, the crowds would gather, not to worship or to gawk, but to continue the conversation that had begun on that misty morning in London. The nation had not broken down that day, as the headline might have suggested. Instead, it had broken through cynicism, through division, through the assumption that things had to remain as they had always been. In the simple act of removing barriers, of choosing connection over protocol, William and Kate had shown a nation how to heal itself. Their gesture, silent but profound, had spoken a truth that resonated through the years. That power's highest purpose is not to maintain distance, but to bridge it, not to stand apart, but to stand with, not to rule, but to serve. In choosing vulnerability over invulnerability, in offering their authentic selves rather than their royal personas, they had transformed not just the monarchy, but the very idea of what it meant to lead. The barriers that came down that day were never rebuilt. In their place grew something stronger, a sense of shared humanity that transcended class, race, religion, and all the other divisions that societies create. The future king and queen had shown that even the oldest institutions could change, that even the most entrenched traditions could give way to something better. As the story passed into legend, embellished perhaps in the telling, but true in its essence, parents would tell their children about the day the barriers came down. They would speak of a prince who knelt, and a princess who wept, of a crowd that sang, and a nation that remembered what it meant to be united. And in the telling, the barriers would fall again and again, reminding each new generation that what separates us is never as strong as what connects us, that every barrier is ultimately temporary, waiting for someone with the courage to set it aside. The morning mist had lifted long ago, but the clarity it revealed remained. A nation had indeed broken down that day, broken down the walls that divided it, broken down the assumptions that limited it, broken down the fear that paralyzed it. And in that breaking down, it had found the strength to build something new, something better, something worthy of the trust that William and Kate had shown when they stepped beyond the barriers and into the hearts of their people.